Hello, and welcome to Spirit of America's commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the attacks of 9/11. I'm Jim Hake, founder and CEO of Spirit of America. I'd like to begin by remembering the 3,000 innocents who were killed on 9/11 and honor the tremendous sacrifice of those who have served since. Like many of you, I remember exactly where I was on September 11th, 2001. I was at home in Los Angeles, getting ready to take my two sons to school, when a friend from New York called and told us to turn on the TV. I watched the attacks that day in shock and disbelief. I committed myself to do something to help. At the time I was an entrepreneur, I had no government or military experience, but I did have a profound appreciation for America's freedoms and values. Previous generations struggled and fought for those values and freedoms, and I wanted to do my part to preserve the promise of a free and better life. That motivated me to start Spirit of America. It was clear we need all of America's strengths, not just our government and military. We need the initiative, optimism, and generosity of the American people. We've shown over our history that together, united, we can do anything. That is the spirit of America. We saw it in the months after 9/11 when we united as a country. We saw it again in the last few weeks as people everywhere stepped up to help the crisis in Afghanistan. The main thing that I've learned in the last 20 years is that citizen service, Americans like you and me doing our part, is more important than ever. America's future depends on it. In the next hour, you'll hear reflections on 9/11 from national security and military leaders and members of the Spirit of America team. I spoke with some of them over the last few days, including General H.R. McMaster. General H.R. McMaster is the former National Security Advisor to the President. He retired from the U.S. Army after 34 years of distinguished service. He's now a fellow at the Hoover Institution and a member of the Spirit of America Advisory Board. General McMaster, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Jim, it's great to be with you, and thank you so much for the great work that Spirit of America does to advance our interests and provide support for those who need it, around the world, and especially in this time of crisis in Afghanistan.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the days after the attacks of 9/11 and have you reflect on your thoughts and reactions after those attacks, General.
Well, I think like so many Americans, it was shock followed quickly by anger and a desire to do something, right? To do something to go after those who committed the most destructive terrorist attack in history, the mass murder of nearly 3,000 innocents, and of course, as a soldier, I felt it like deep into my soul that I wanted to be able to be part of an effort to hunt Al Qaeda down and to deny them from ever having a safe haven and support base again. And I was in command of a cavalry squadron in Germany, and we were in between very major training exercises at Hohenfels training area. And of course, the immediate effect was the kind of the clamp down on security around bases and so forth, not knowing really the scope of these attacks, and then certainly a reinvigorated preparation for combat. And of course, our unit did not deploy in that for the first operations against the Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, but the soldiers in our squadron, I would say almost all of them did deploy at some stage to Afghanistan and then later to Iraq.
There's been a fair amount of criticism, as you know, of U.S. policy in the 20 years since 9/11 and skepticism about our nation's role in the world. When you look back on those 20 years, what did we get right as a country?
Well, I think what we got right is the need for us to remain engaged against jihadist terrorists who are a threat to all civilized peoples. I think we learned that lesson, obviously, the hard way with a tremendous cost on September 11th, 2001. We have to remember Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda just didn't appear in 2001, right? It had a long history that went back to the Mujahideen era resistance to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and it was the alumni of the Mujahideen who then formed the core of Al Qaeda around Osama bin Laden. This organization declared war on us in the early 1990s. We didn't really pay attention to that. organized the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993 with truck bombs. We didn't pay enough attention to that. Organized attacks against us and our embassies in 1998. And what did? We fired a few cruise missiles, what you might call an over-the-horizon approach to jihadist terrorism, and called it a day. So I think the story that's told in The Looming Tower, other books about the history of Al Qaeda prior to 2001 is important to understand and is instructive in connection with the need to sustain an effort, really alongside partners who bear the brunt of the fight against jihadist terrorists. And if we don't sustain that effort, we're setting ourselves up for more attacks, hopefully not on the scale of 9/11, but I believe the danger is increasing.
Well, you mentioned America not paying adequate attention to the years leading up to 9/11. And at 9/11, the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party was not on the horizon of many. Why should Americans care about the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, now as a threat that we might look back on and say we didn't pay enough attention?
We didn't pay enough attention, I think, because we tend to cling to flawed assumptions for too long about the nature of particular competitions. I think one of the assumptions was those terrorists, look at how strong America is militarily. How could they attack us? Well, I think it's important to understand that there are two ways that our enemies can fight us. One is, stupidly, which I think you could say the Iraqis picked in the Gulf War, or asymmetrically, right, to try to avoid our strengths and attack weaknesses. And this is what China has done in a really sustained campaign of what I would describe as co-option, coercion, and concealment. There's a very strong informational and economic dimension to this competition, where they try to co-opt countries and companies, right, with the lure of access to the Chinese market or the lure of Chinese investment or loans. But once you're in, to coerce you to adhere to the party's objectives and to support its effort to promote its authoritarian mercantilist model. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that then China tries to just conceal this as normal business practices. Well, it's not. It's a pernicious campaign that, if China succeeds, will make the world less free, less prosperous, and less safe. And what China is endeavoring to do, the Chinese Communist Party, to extend and tighten its exclusive grip on power. The means by which it's doing that are egregious. It involves genocide. It involves extending its repressive arm into Hong Kong and extinguishing human freedom there. It involves hostage taking as an element of this effort. And it involves really threats to its neighbors and threats to Taiwan in particular. And so it's important for us to compete effectively, Jim. And I think for too long we clung to the assumption that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules. And as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. The opposite is the case, because we didn't really consider the degree to which ideology drives and constrains Chinese Communist Party leaders. And I think now the world is waking up to this competition, and it's important that we compete, not just militarily in terms of deterring the People's Liberation Army and its effort to create exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific, but that we can compete economically and from an informational perspective. And I think that we use what should be our competitive advantages in connection with our democratic principles and institutions and processes to our advantage.
Looking back in the years since 9/11, what have you seen in America that encourages you or gives you hope for the future?
Well, what I've seen in America are young men and women in our armed forces who volunteered to serve our nation in time of war. I think they're the best of America. For those who lament, the younger generations and or disparage them, I should say, and say that they're self-centered or they're aimless and so forth. I mean, all you have to do is look at this youngest generation in our armed forces. And of course, we know that just last week, 13 of those courageous servicemen and women, died on a modern day frontier between barbarism and humanity. And so that's what has encouraged me the most, right? As a leader in our armed forces, your job is, to provide your servicemen and women with purpose, motivation, and direction, as we say in the Army, but oftentimes I drew my motivation from our young soldiers.
And as you look to the future, General, what's on your mind and what would you want Americans to be thinking about?
Well, I think we need a period of introspection to recognize that our efforts in Afghanistan have failed mainly because of our failure of will. I think, Jim, what is sad about this anniversary is that we have surrendered essentially to a jihadist terrorist organization. And we've done that because we defeated ourselves by demonstrating a lack of will to sustain the effort. The effort in Afghanistan was difficult. It was beset by a series of ineffective, ill-conceived, and inconsistent policies and strategies over time. But I think it's important to recognize in the last couple of years there, we did everything we could, it seemed, to bolster the strength of the Taliban and deliver psychological and physical blows in terms of the withdrawal of our support from the Afghan government and Afghan security forces. So I don't think there was anything inevitable about the collapse of the situation in Afghanistan. I think sadly, we actually aided and abetted that collapse. And what we're seeing now is just the beginning of a new phase of the war. Hey, wars don't end, when one side disengages. And I think what Americans have to do is to understand better what is at stake in these conflicts, and our leaders have to generate the will necessary to sustain our efforts. And I think we ought to all remember, especially on this anniversary of 9/11, what G.K. Chesterton observed. This is the early 20th century British philosopher and theologian. He said that wars may not be the best way of settling differences, but they're the only way to ensure they're not settled for you. And I think we're only seeing the beginning of a humanitarian, a political, and a security catastrophe centered on our surrender and withdrawal from Afghanistan.
General, thank you very much for joining us. We greatly appreciate your time and greatly appreciate your involvement with Spirit of America.
Thank you, Jim.
Former commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command. Admiral Olson served more than 38 years in the U.S. Navy and is a member of the Spirit of America Advisory Board. Welcome, Admiral Olson, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you, especially on this most important day.
Could you tell us all where you were on 9/11 and what your first thoughts and reactions were?
I was a one-star admiral in charge of Naval Special Warfare Command, the command that includes Navy SEALs and mini submarines and boats and all of the supporting forces. I was away from my office in a school on 9/11. It took me a few days to get back, but I had already been tuned in to Al-Qaeda, to Osama bin Laden himself, through some previous assignments, through some previous work. And my sense was that this was going to be a drawn-out campaign. I sent a message to my force asking them to prepare for a marathon and pace themselves accordingly. I did an interview that said, in which I said that this war would not be fought the hardest by those who were already in the military, but by those who were in high school. And unfortunately, I missed by several years. It turned out being people who were infants on 9/11 who ended up closing out our operations in Afghanistan.
And there's a lot of discussion, of course, about how America responded to the attacks and whether the response was worth it. Tell us what you thought we got right.
Well, I think at the troop level, which is always our greatest strength, they accomplished the mission that they were sent to accomplish. The original mission in Afghanistan was to prevent additional terrorist attacks from coming at us from that terrain. And Al-Qaeda was evicted from Afghanistan, not to return in any meaningful kind of a way. And for now 20 years and counting, no terrorist attack has come at us from that territory that our troops went to secure in that way. And they also, and I think this is really important, they also provided a generation of Afghans otherwise impossible opportunities. Education, especially girls, businesses, especially women, global engagement through the internet, a higher standard of health in most of the regions of Afghanistan. And so it's a different Afghanistan now than if our troops had not gone there and done what they did, made the sacrifices that they did as part of that. The Taliban won't be able to rule in the same way they did before because it's a more enlightened country. We're already seeing some of the protests against the Taliban in ways that we didn't see before. So I'm encouraged by that.
And, observing not only the military, in which you served so in such a distinguished fashion, Admiral, but when you look at America more broadly, what have you seen in the country since 9/11 that is encouraging, that encourages you?
Yeah, I think after 9/11, the operations in Afghanistan brought Americans together in powerful ways. Some of that has eroded over time, but I think that what has endured from those early days are respect for American servicemen and women and a high appreciation for what they do, a broader understanding of and support for those who suffered the invisible wounds of combat in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and a generosity manifested through donations to charitable organizations and in many other ways that support veterans and their families, wounded veterans, caregivers. Your own example with Spirit America is really a powerful one in that regard. You repurposed your life on 9/11 in order to support the operations of America overseas, and it's had a powerful effect.
Well, and as you look at the various threats and challenges that we face as a nation, and as you know, there are more than enough of them. What are you most concerned about looking at the future?
I am concerned about some big things, global challenges like climate change and pollution of our air and our oceans, and the seeming inability of us as a global community to get together to solve these things that we all recognize are going to have a detrimental effect on our planet and on humanity. Geopolitically, I agree with H.R. McMaster. I'm concerned about China's intent to become the world's hyperpower and the methods by which they are doing that. I'm less concerned about industrial strength, military fisticuffs with China. I think they are coming at us asymmetrically. I think the competition with China is already relatively mature. It's not a future event. And cyber activity, its economic power, its regional dominance, its activities in space, and many more, that if we don't tend to each of them and tend to each of those aggressively, we'll find ourselves sort of unable to challenge them as much more time goes by.
Well, with all those challenges, you teach and you give talks to groups of all sorts across the country, and people hear about those challenges. What do you tell them when they say, "What can I do?" What's your advice to anyone listening in today about what can be done?
First, I thank them for asking, and my first comment back is that our national security is everyone's responsibility, and if all of the nation leaves our national security to a small portion of the nation, we simply won't be as secure. And there's much that each of us can do to be better citizens in ways that strengthen all of us. The first thing I say is vote. Vote responsibly. Encourage others to do so. Our democracy is our greatest strength. It is what gives us our status in the world. And to put that at risk by failure to participate in that most fundamental right and obligation of citizenship leaves us weaker. I encourage people to have faith in our enduring institutions of government. Yes, they can be overly bureaucratic. Sometimes they can be wrong, but they are here to serve us and provide the fundamental foundations of our health, our safety, and our security. And the more we believe in them, the stronger we all will be. And then, of course, I ask people to find ways to actively support through nonprofit organizations what they believe in, especially those that encourage young people to be better and more active citizens for military service or for non-military service in their communities. There are many ways to support this, many ways to volunteer to do that, essentially an infinite number of ways to get involved for the way people want to get involved or find an interest in being involved in ways that suit them.
Well, that's awesome advice. Thank you. And thank you, Admiral, for being with us today. And thank you very much for being part of the Spirit of America team.
Thank you for your leadership, Jim. I'm proud to be on the team.
Hi, I'm Lauren Power, Director of Communications at Spirit of America. I'm excited to welcome singer and songwriter Joe Smith. Joe, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm honored to be here.
Joe, you're not only a talented musician and Nashville recording artist, but you're also an active duty U.S. Navy Reserve officer. What inspired you to join the Navy?
Well, it's actually twofold, and it's an unconventional story. I was singing and attending Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and I got asked to sing the national anthem at a commissioning ceremony, at which Vice Admiral Nora Tyson was speaking and delivering the oath of office, and I just thought she was the coolest individual. I spoke with her. She kind of gave me some great advice on life and said, reach out if you ever need anything. We fell out of touch for a while. Still, it never occurred to me to enter the military. I was in my early 30s and just didn't think that it was possible, which is sad. I didn't know that there were opportunities for someone like me that might like to serve and do that. Long story short, ended up taking a break from music in order to raise money on one hand for a record, and just wanted to kind of get out of Music Row for a while. So I ended up in Somalia. And I worked for the State Department in a company called Bancroft there, and met my husband there, who's a retired Navy SEAL, and another retired intelligence officer. And then they started kind of introducing the idea of the Navy Reserve, which I didn't know that I could do. So that was kind of how it started. They planted the seed, and I've had some great military mentors along the way to guide me through it, and I haven't regretted it.
That's great. Given your experiences, what role do you think people can play in spreading American goodwill and supporting the U.S. mission without putting on a uniform?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Spirit of America obviously is a great place to start. It's really where I started with it. I received a random email in my inbox about what they were doing, what you guys were doing. And, at the same time I was studying counterinsurgency, and I loved the fact that you guys focused on winning hearts and minds. And it really appealed to me and resonated with what I was learning in school. And for the folks out there on the live stream, that's buying bats and balls for the local village kids, sewing machines for women in Helmand Province. I just thought that was great and so American. But aside from that, if you're not able to donate to a great cause like Spirit of America, I think that the most important thing you can do, and there's more opportunity now, I'll caveat with, than there's ever been to make an impact as we kind of pivot to great power competition, GPC. Take lessons from the military, lessons that I've learned later in life, where I take my emotions, I listen to them, they tell me what matters to me, but then I put them aside and I try to look at things objectively. And when I get my information and my news and I try to educate myself about what's going on, I vet those sources. And unfortunately, in the time that we live in, your best sources are the ones that are probably the most boring to read. They're the most thought out. And I just encourage everybody to do that. You know, as an intelligence officer, I learn more and more every day about the threats that we are going to be facing in the future. And I just think being a thoughtful person, being a service-minded person, just taking your lessons from the military is a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you were kind enough to record 2 songs for our program today. Tell us about the first song called American Child.
Well, this is a song that I actually wrote years ago, and it's just been sitting on a shelf, and it seemed like the perfect time to bring it out. Every lyric is more meaningful to me now than it even was when I wrote it, for 2 reasons. I'm 22 weeks pregnant with my first baby boy, and you'll see in the lyric why that is meaningful to me. And then just seeing the images, you know, coming from Afghanistan, I think that we've ignored Afghanistan and the normal news media for a while. And, you know, when you see people with that level of desperation to come here, you realize how fortunate you are to have been born here. And that's what this song is about.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Joe. Let's watch and enjoy.
Mama soon to be walking down the street, proudly hold your head up high. The land where you live, the life that you give, and baby's gonna be alright. American child, you'll be born with wings to fly, ride your own destiny, be who you wanna be. Let your fearless spirit go run wild, American child. Little dirty feet running down the street, you can't help where you grow up. In that bus to school, laid a smile on you, you'll get the chance to rise above. American child, you were born with wings to fly, ride your own destiny, be who you wanna be. Let your fearless spirit go run wild, American child. Cross those oceans, climb the mountains, do it if you dream about it. Here in the land of the free, you can do anything, you can be anything. American child, you were born with wings to fly, ride your own destiny, be who you wanna be. Let your fearless spirit go run wild, American child. Nice.
Wow, that was that was beautiful, Joe. I think Admiral Olson's going to have to add to his advice to everyone, which is listen to more Joe Smith. It was the first time I'd heard that song. That was just beautiful. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to welcome Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Pakistan, Kuwait, Lebanon, and twice to Afghanistan. He is also an honorary United States Marine and recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Ambassador Crocker, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Can you share your own reflections from the attacks of 9/11? Just tell us where you were and what were your first thoughts and reactions?
On 9/11, I had just recently returned from Syria. I was ambassador to Syria 2008, 1998 to 2001. I had been on the job as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs about 10 days when 9/11 came along. And I was actually on a U.S. Air shuttle that morning from D.C. up to New York. I was going to sit down with the Russian permanent representative, Sergei Lavrov, now the foreign minister, and talk about Iraq. So on the descent over Manhattan, we could see from the plane the smoke coming out of the first tower. And we were asking ourselves, how could somebody run a plane into the World Trade Center on a brilliant blue morning? The second tower was struck just as we touched down at LaGuardia, and we had our answer. I was stuck in traffic on the Queensboro Bridge, and from there I saw both towers go down. Went back to Long Island, rented a car from Avis. They said, whatever you do not take this car off of Long Island. I said, Roger, and took the car off Long Island straight away to make the long drive back to DC. And on that long drive, I reflected over another incident, the assassination of Ahmad Shah Massoud in Afghanistan by a couple of Al-Qaeda suiciders posing as a TV crew for an interview. And at the time, I said, why on earth would Al-Qaeda do that? Well, I had that answer too. Al-Qaeda wanted to take the most competent and effective anti-Taliban leader off the field prior to 9/11. They were looking ahead strategically that this would be traced to them. And what they didn't want was Ahmad Shah Massoud teaming up with us in a military effort. And having reached that conclusion along about Delaware, I thought that, well, this is going to change my life dramatically. I don't know how, but it's going to change. And it certainly did.
There's been many observations and a good bit of criticism about how America responded to 9/11, whether that response was worth it. So two elements of that. What's the main thing that we got wrong, and what did we get right?
Jim, as I look back again at 9/11, 20 years on, I actually think we got most of it right. So everything I did and that the State Department did from that day forward was aimed at ensuring that Afghanistan would never again threaten the U.S. as it had done on 9/11. So there was a strategic point there, a never again moment. Having established that, then you get into a discussion of means to the end. And that involved, do we try to do something for girls' education? Do we try to improve the transport system? Moving ahead and looking ahead on the necessity to help with the rise of a new Afghanistan that would be completely different than the Afghanistan that brought us 9/11. So the strategic purpose, I think, never altered. Certainly it didn't for me. It was extremely clear why I was in Kabul. in 2002. But it was just as clear when I got back to Afghanistan as ambassador in 2011. That didn't change. What did change was a debate, if you will, on the best means to ensure that our homeland was never again vulnerable to an attack launched from Afghan soil. The societal change they need, still very vulnerable, still underway. And I'm pretty concerned right now what's going to happen, for example, to those women and girls who stepped into the classroom and then, at our urging, stepped into society as members of parliament, military officers, entrepreneurs. We put a lot of effort into that. They demonstrated a lot of courage. And frankly, I'm concerned now what's going to happen with that initiative and with them.
What have you seen in America since 9/11 that is encouraging to you?
Well, we're seeing it right now, Jim, in a very real way. A lot of Americans, including me, were pretty upset the way the end game in Afghanistan for U.S. presence on the ground, how that ended. You can have a conversation on whether full withdrawal was the right thing to do. I opposed it, but again, you can have that conversation. The implementation was frankly heart-wrenching. It was just awful to have to watch. Now, to the administration's credit, they didn't try to sweep it under the carpet. They've stepped up and said, yeah, we didn't get everybody out that we needed to get out. And you see, even as we speak, the State Department leading an initiative to bring in regional countries that can serve as transit points. But most importantly, to get at your question, to get the home front right. And in our deeply divided, highly polarized society, it's been very gratifying to see that Americans are coming together on one critical point, which is welcoming Afghan refugees who have had to leave their homes into ours. And the way that's building now, it is not a partisan issue. Republicans and Democrats both support resettling Afghan refugees who had risked their lives in support of our mission to resettle them in our country as our friends and neighbors. And that's the best of America. And it's been a source of great pride to me and I tell you this frankly, to be affiliated with Spirit of America, with our terrific teams out there doing just that. Wherever these refugees are emerging in third countries where they're going to need some help and support, you've got the Spirit of America team there to live up to the American promise and really to get ready for the next step in the American dream for these refugees who right now have nothing but are guaranteed to make America a better place.
Well, the citizen response has been very encouraging, and we all wish that it weren't necessary, but that Americans have sprung into action the way that they have is a very positive thing, especially in the today's polarized environment that you mentioned. Well, Ambassador, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you so much for being part of our team at Spirit of America.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's nothing makes me prouder than to be associated with your great organization when it is put to the test and is showing the world and showing our own country just what America can do.
Our final conversation is with the Honorable Michelle Flournoy. Michelle is a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and a Principal Advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Now she is Managing Partner of West Exec Advisors and a member of our advisory board. Michelle, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be with you, Jim.
So I'd like to go back to the attacks of 9/11, and if you could just say a few things about where you were and what you were working on at the time, and we'll take it from there.
So I was actually in a meeting right across from the White House in an office building. And we were looking at some issues of defense reform, which was sort of a hot issue of the day. And someone came in to the office and said, have you seen the news? Turn on the television. There have been these planes that have crashed into the World Trade Center. And so we all stopped the meeting and turned on the television. And next thing we know, someone else burst into the room and said, "There's another plane. It's heading towards Washington, possibly the White House or the Congress. We are across the street. We need to evacuate now." And so the whole building emptied out. People, all around the White House were leaving the area. And I walked back to my office on 18th and K, only to find that it had become a total traffic jam and parking gridlock, and there was no way I was ever going to get out of there. And so I went back to my office and started trying to field media calls, trying to process what has just happened. Who is Al Qaeda? Why have they struck us? What is going on? What does this mean? And so I spent a lot of my time, stuck in my office and trying to, talk with people who were trying to make sense of it. So that was my initial experience that day.
And as you know, many have been skeptical of the country's response since those attacks. And there's been criticism. I think the last 20 years have given everyone something to disagree with in some way, shape, or form. But looking back on those 20 years, what did America get right?
I think what we got right was some sense of national unity and pulling together as a society to help each other through this. I mean, whether it was the people who ran to the Pentagon to help once the plane hit. I remember frantically calling people in the Pentagon that day, trying to find out if my friends and colleagues were okay. But people ran to the scene to help. The think tank where I was working, we didn't drop everything, but we dropped a lot to pull together a multidisciplinary study and put out a book in a matter of 6 months, trying to outline, a whole of nation, approach to dealing with counterterrorism or with terrorism more effectively. You had people, mobilize and join the military, join aid organizations, join nonprofits. It really felt like a country coming together in the wake of a tragedy, and sort of surmounting our differences, and coming together with a common sense of purpose. Now, you can criticize different policy decisions that were made in the wake of that, but I think that moment of coming together was quite powerful for many, many people.
Yes, I agree. And what can Americans do to get us back to that place of unity and common purpose, do you think?
Well, I think one of the things we have to do now is take stock of where we are today. And we're coming out of a global pandemic. We're trying to get our economy moving again. We're trying to make that economy more fair and equitable for all Americans, more participatory. We have some real challenges to our competitiveness on the global stage. And so I really think this is a time like the post 9/11 period where we have to come together, surmount some of our political divisions, and ask the question, how do we as Americans stand together to sort of protect our economic security, our national security, and to compete more effectively in a more challenging, period going forward. We are really good as Americans at picking ourselves up and dusting ourselves off and demonstrating incredible resilience, whether it was coming out of the Great Depression or World War II or Vietnam or 9/11 or, this most recent pandemic. I think we have it in us to do that, but we need some strong leadership.
And Michelle, where do you think the leadership to bring people together and pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off, where do you think that leadership is most likely to come from?
Well, I'd love to see it come from, the White House and Congress, but I really think it has to come from all of this. So much of this happens at the community level, with examples of people coming together to serve others, with examples of kind of people answering the call to help. I've been very heartened just watching the response of many communities across the country, to receive and help resettle, Afghans who've come out of Afghanistan and have been at great risk and, are coming to this country with basically nothing. But they helped us in our time of need, and now it's our turn to help them resettle and find a new life here in this country. And I've been very pleased to see that this hasn't been a highly partisan issue. People have come together from across, political lines, religious lines, class lines, and they're stepping forward to help these folks. So that's been heartening.
It has been very encouraging. And one of the things that seems to be a fallout of the results in Afghanistan is those who wonder, why does America need to remain engaged in the world? And what do you say to those folks who wonder why America should stay engaged in the world and the ways that we have been over the last 20 years plus?
Well, I think, history tells us that U.S. leadership, we don't always get it right, but U.S. leadership has consistently been really important to pulling together the coalitions necessary to deal with our biggest problems, be that climate change or terrorism or nonproliferation or a pandemic. U.S. leadership is pretty indispensable. There's really no other country that's capable of pulling big portions of the international community together to deal with these issues. So I think that's still very important, and that's something we need to be willing to do going forward as Americans. It's sort of a unique inheritance and sometimes a burden, but also an opportunity. If we don't deal with these things far from our shores, they have a way of showing up on our shores in much more costly and sometimes catastrophic ways. So it's in our interest to be engaged, to try to deter and prevent threats from becoming larger ones, and to try to shape the international environment in ways that protect us.
And it seems as though the number of adversaries and challenges we face as a nation have grown since 9/11. And well, first of all, do you think that's true? And secondly, which of those adversaries and challenges that we face are you most concerned about looking forward?
I do think we have a much more, daunting inheritance, if you will, in terms of the number and diversity of challenges that we face. I think climate change has the potential to be an existential threat to us and to the globe. So that is one that has caught up with us, and we absolutely have to take urgent steps at scale to deal with that. We have fundamental shifts in the geopolitical environment with the rise of China, and a China that it wants to rewrite the rules of the international order in ways that could be detrimental to us and to our allies and to other democracies. We have a pretty persistent and revanchist Russia under Putin that's still, making mischief in various parts of the world. We have very persistent rogue threats like North Korea and Iran that are still pursuing nuclear weapons programs that pose dangers. And, the threat of transnational terrorism, although it hasn't it hasn't gone away, it has certainly morphed into new forms that we still have to get after and deal with. So, and then we haven't even talked about the potential for future pandemics. So it's a very daunting basket of issues, but it is. I feel confident that the United States is up to the challenge. When we invest in the drivers of our own competitiveness, when we have a sense of common purpose and the leadership to help reinforce that, we can do just about anything. There's no other country in the world whose hand I would like to be playing right now, other than that of the United States.
I agree. And I was going to ask you, in addition to what you're most concerned about, what you're most hopeful about, but I think you just answered. Is there anything else, reflecting back on the last 20 years from a national security perspective and the leadership that you provided, that you'd like to add, that you'd like Americans to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I have huge faith in the American people. I'm privileged to work with a lot of young people and young leaders, very diverse group, and they're awe-inspiring. I have such faith in their ability to take this country forward, their commitment to serve their communities and the nation. And we don't always get it right. As I said, it's very important for us to take time to try to learn some of the hard lessons when we do stumble or fall short. But we've shown our ability to do that again and again. And I remain very hopeful for the future, even as we confront this very daunting set of circumstances.
Well, Michelle, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for spending time with us today, and thank you for being part of the Spirit of America team as well.
Yeah, well, again, just kudos for what you and Spirit of America do every single day to advance and protect our interests. I think Spirit of America embodies the spirit of America. It embodies the kind of what we can do when we pool our efforts and focus on, what is best about what this country has to offer the world. So thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you, Michelle.
Take care.
I'm very grateful for our guests today and for their service. And I'm grateful for all those who have served and sacrificed in the last 20 years, for the loved ones we've lost, and for those they've left behind. The world has changed drastically since the attacks of 9/11 and since I founded Spirit of America. There are fewer and fewer troops in combat. We've withdrawn from Afghanistan, but the threats and challenges to America's security and way of life are growing. Al-Qaeda is still a problem, and there's the Islamic State, Russia, the Chinese Communist Party, and more. That's tough. The even tougher news is that there is no cavalry riding to our rescue. Our government and military can't do it alone. All of us, America's citizens, we are the cavalry. The good news is we can do it. We've done it throughout America's history, and we can do it now. Individual citizens can make a huge difference, and Spirit of America proves that. We have a very small team, and what that team has accomplished is extraordinary. We've worked alongside U.S. troops and diplomats in 90 countries and implemented thousands of projects in support of their work. There are American troops with lives and limbs today because of the work that our team has done. We've given hope and new opportunities to people in the toughest places on earth. And we've shown the world the very best of America and what we stand for. So citizens like us must take action to preserve the promise of a free and better life. It's been that way since America was founded. You don't have to wear a uniform to serve the nation. And we all need to serve in the ways that we can. So thank you again for joining us. And now, Joe Smith will close with the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching